Good afternoon, everybody. Most of you have been here numerous times. My name is Bill Medowich. I'm the president of Fort Tabor, Fort Rawdon Military Museum, and Veterans Memorial. I welcome you all here to our speaker series, our winter speaker series, as we call it. Seeing as in the summertime, they want to charge you to park. Today we have Dr. Joshua Meeks. He's an associate professor at the College of Distance Education, U.S. Naval College, Newport, Rhode Island. He's going to be talking about the Pacific Theater, the strategic part of it, which actually was one of the big parts of winning the war. I'm not going to go on too long because I talk too much. So again, Professor Meeks.
Thank you very much.
Oh, if you do have a phone, because I just remembered to do mine, please turn it off.
I'm going
At least silence it.
Yeah, I'm going to make sure I did that for mine too. There we go. As you said, I am Dr. Joshua Meeks. I work at the U.S. Naval War College, and as such, I am obligated to first and foremost say that nothing I say here is representative of the view of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, Department of Navy, or U.S. Naval War College. I am speaking here in my own personal capacity. So while some of the times when I give lectures or give talks, I'm talking about things that the U.S. government does not care at all about. This is one of those that does overlap a good bit with my day job. My day job is as a strategy and policy professor. And we were talking earlier, the way that I would describe this is a lot of the officers that come through my classroom, they're 03s, 04s, and they're coming from tactical areas of expertise. They're very, very good at a very specific thing they do.
They won't know what 03 or 04
03s, mid-grade officers. They are usually in the 8 to 10 year mark of their career. Sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later, but this is as they are going on into command. They come to my classroom and they're coming out of tactics, and they're mostly supposed to be learning operations, how to think a little bit bigger. What my job is to try to get them thinking to the next stage. The next stage is where they should be thinking strategically. So that's the way I tend to approach a lot of the material that I engage with. I am a historian by training. I'm actually a Napoleonic War historian by training. So if you have any questions about Napoleon, feel free to ask those as well. But at the U.S. Naval War College, they care less about that and more about this overall transition between thinking about military history as a historical artifact, as something that happened in the past, and how we can use it, how we can use that to understand our contemporary security environment. So you'll see that as I go through the talk today. That's partly what informs my approach to the past, is not just thinking about the past, but also thinking about how we can apply it to the present in a very real, granular sense. Not just lessons learned, but how I can get people to be thinking about it when they go out and fight the next war. So to that end, one of the things what I want to frame the talk about today is hidden victories, cumulative pressure, and the long road to control in the Pacific. I'm not going to go through an overview of the talk at the forefront, but this is let's just say that it's a slightly off-center way of looking at the Pacific Theater. Most likely, I'm going to assume kind of a somewhat basic level of what happened in the Pacific Theater, right? We start with Pearl Harbor, we end with the atomic bomb, right? So the narrative of how we get from point A to point Z at the end of the story usually is told through a history of battles. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'll talk about that as a sequential approach. But the focus that I want to emphasize is that that's not the entirety of the story. There's a lot more that goes on in achieving victory that goes on below the surface. In this case, quite literally below the surface a lot of times if we're talking about submarine warfare. But the overall intent here is how to look at the things that don't necessarily show up on a map, the things that you don't necessarily always read in the history books that are just going to focus on the highlights. Now, I also will say that I am enthralled, and I say this somewhat as a warning, enthralled by the idea of theory. When I look at strategy and when I look at war, a lot of what I'm trying to look at is not just the battles themselves, but the overall connective tissue that combines it, that gives it meaning. How do we approach a question like victory? How do we understand that not just as, oh yeah, there, I won, but why did I win? What does victory mean, right? These are the types of things that really interest me as a historian and as a professor of strategy. So in brief, I just want to talk a little bit about what theory means in this sense. And I'm not going to go too much in detail, but I'm going to be framing the talk around theory and around a specific person's theory that we'll get to in a second. So just a little bit about that overall. Now, when theory happens at the Naval War College, a lot of times we're talking about these two guys at the bottom specifically, about Karl von Clausewitz and Alfred Thayer Mahan. We'll throw in some Julian Corbett. We might throw in some Sun Tzu. We'll even be really kind of crazy and say Mao Zedong as a theorist or Thucydides as a theorist. But these are the two guys that really bear a lot of the weight when we talk about theory. Karl von Clausewitz, in his famous book On War, talks a lot about war as a continuation of politics as other means. And I'm not going to go into all this Clausewitzian theory, but he talks not just about what war is on an operational level, but how we think about war, what war means to a state, to a society, and to a soldier. The same with Alfred Thayer Mahan. When he talks about naval theory and naval warfare, yes, he talks about ships. He does talk a little bit about tactics. You shouldn't listen to him talking about tactics because he ran his ship aground. But nonetheless, right, he is someone who can do the tactical operational level, but when he thinks about war, what he's thinking about is what is the characteristics of a successful nation at war? What is it that makes a state win? Right, these are the deeper questions. So the way in honor of the day that is today, the Super Bowl Sunday, another way to approach that is when you look at a football game, what is it that you are looking at? Are you looking at the highlights? There's nothing wrong with looking at the highlights, right? Like you can look at the highlights and you can get a good sense of how the war or how the battle or how the game was won. I'm not saying that that's the wrong way to look at a game or look at the war. What I am saying is that there's more to it, right? Another way that you can look at a game and get that narrative of the game is by looking at the box score, right? You can look at the box score and you can kind of say like, okay, who passed for this much? Who was the receiver? Who was their primary target? Were there a lot of misses? Or are we talking 60 throws a game? Are we talking 20? What's the completion percentage? And you can get a good sense of the game through looking at the box score, right? So that's partly what I want to do a little bit today is not just looking at the highlights, but looking a little bit at the stat box, if you will. But there's another element that's necessary to understanding how the game was won or how the war was won, and that's the rules. That's the playbooks, right? That's the things that you'll never really see that still inform the shape and nature of the game itself. It's what happened last week. It's what they're looking forward to next week, right? Not in this case next week, but right, these are the type of things that actually do matter beyond the highlights, beyond the box score, even beyond the game itself. So when we think about theory, that's what I want us to want to frame this as, is not just looking at the highlights, not just looking at the battles of the Pacific Theater, not just looking at the big moments that we know and that are critically important. I am not trying to diminish those, but looking beyond that and trying to connect it all together. Looking at the what, the how, the why it happened, the when it happened, and how, and all that together. When we talk about theory and war, we can talk about a lot of different theories when we think about war. We can talk about what is war, we can talk about who fights war, we can talk about the relationship between violence and people. All of these different things can certainly fall into the theory bucket. For my purposes though, I'm particularly interested in, and when I talk about theory, the theoretical question I want to look at is how do you win, right? And I think that should go without saying that that's a pretty important theoretical question, right? But it's not just how do you win, it's what does winning mean? What does it look like? How do you know when you have won? That seems like a simple thing. Well, I've won when the other guy has said that I've won. Do you really want to like give it up and just kind of wait until the other guy says that you've won? Do you want to give up agency for victory, or do you want to claim the narrative of victory? But how do you do that? Have you won when, in this case in the Pacific War, when you dropped the nuclear bomb? That's a good way to know that you've won. And if you're going to ask a lot of people, how was the Pacific Theater won? How was the Pacific War won? One of the easiest and best answers is going to be Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's how the war was won. But my argument here is that when you think about a theory of victory, and if you get trapped into thinking that's the way the war was won, not looking at the constituent elements, you're missing something. And again, looking in terms of the practical elements, if you fall into that trap, if you fall into the trap of only looking at the flashiest thing, the biggest narrative in terms of how victory was achieved and what that theory of victory might mean, you're going to start crafting and thinking and expecting the wrong things in war, and that's a danger. So that more or less informs kind of this broad theoretical overview of how I'm approaching this, what I am trying to do here. Now, the third person up here is who we'll actually spend more time with, and that is J.C. Bill Wiley. Wiley, a Rear Admiral, we'll start here. Admiral J.C. Wiley, yeah, and he, Joseph Wiley, but he went by Bill. I will admit a little bit of hometown favoritism here. After he retired, he went and he taught at the Naval War College. He actually ended up dying in Portsmouth, the town. He's buried at a cemetery I would take my son to walks on. So this is someone that I like because he's close to home, but I also will argue and hopefully show today that what he brings to offer and how we understand war and the Pacific Theater in particular is incredibly powerful, incredibly impactful. So he was a Rear Admiral. He's not going to be someone who he's never a 3-star, 4-star, didn't get into the upper echelons of the military establishment, but still very successful in his own right. He is also not someone who just thought about war. Again, I'm not trying to throw Alfred Thayer Mahan under the bus, but Alfred Thayer Mahan, as a military theorist, didn't actually fight hardly at all, right? He thought a lot, but he was not someone who did a lot of he was not a practitioner. That's not true with Admiral Wiley. Admiral Wiley absolutely was a practitioner, and the moment that I'll kind of anchor us in is when he was the XO on the destroyer, the Fletcher, in Guadalcanal. He is sitting there now. What he was he was a combat information systems officer. So he's not sitting there on the he's not a surface warfare officer. He's not firing the big guns. He's not commanding from the deck at this point. What he primarily is doing is experiencing the war, experiencing the Pacific theater of the war, in a very dark, very musty room where he's looking at charts and graphs. He's looking a little bit at maps, but he's looking at dots on a board. That's the war to him, not all of the action, but something a little bit more esoteric, something a little bit harder to grasp. But he's also in Guadalcanal, watching the intensity of this battle. Guadalcanal, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, is an incredibly intense battle, incredibly intense. So he has these two things in tension in his experience, and he spends most of the rest of his career working on these ideas and working through this tension of the very boring aspects of war that are just in a musty little room, and the very flashy parts of war that happen on the surface, that happen when you are looking at the big explosions that are taking place. He develops these ideas in this book, Military Strategy, A General Theory of Power Control. It's actually a very short book. I won't give a full-throated recommendation. It is very dense. I have a few clips of it, or I have a few excerpts that you can read. But if you're interested, I do recommend it. It's not something that's going to take you 20 years to read. It's going to take you, not too much time. But you can also just listen to me talk about it. So when he talks about control, this is what he means, this theory of power control. He says that victory is not something that just happens because you've beaten the other guy. Victory happens when you control the enemy. And I'll read this quote here. So it's proposed here that a general theory of strategy should be some development of the following fundamental theme. The primary aim of the strategist in the conduct of war is some selected degree of control of the enemy's strategist the enemy for the strategist's own purpose. This is achieved by control of the pattern of war, and this control of the pattern of war is had by manipulation of the center of gravity to the advantage of the strategist and the disadvantage of the opponent. So what does he mean by this? What does control actually look like? And this is a core element to his idea, is that control ultimately, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it, he says control is exercised by a man with a gun on the ground. Like, he's not an eye in the sky, kind of, head in the clouds type of guy. How do you win war? You win wars with a guy on the ground with a gun. The question is, what is that guy on the ground with a gun doing? How many people do you actually need on the ground? Are they on the right piece of ground? How are they supplied? All of those things are just as important as the guy on the ground. Ultimately, the element of control is going to be with that person on the ground. But there's so much more to it than just having one person, just having a person on the ground. So control for him equals victory. It means that you are constraining your enemy's choices in a way that is advantageous to you. At its simplest, that's what it means. How do you achieve that becomes the core of what he develops in this book. And his argument is that there are two ways to achieve control. The first is sequential. Sequential is the step-by-step. It's the ladder, right? It's you are climbing the ladder of war. And that ladder is contested, right? This is, you're not just, oh yeah, la-di-da, I'm going to climb up here and I'm going to achieve victory, yay for me. No, you're climbing and you might get punched in the face and you might go back down a few rungs. But ultimately you know what the next step is. The next step is the next rung in the ladder. In the case of the Pacific Theater, the next step is the next island in the chain. It's the next battle. To win that battle, you have to have won the previous battle. To get to that battle, you have to have won the previous battle. It is logical. It is a sequence of events. And we're comfortable with that. And it's important. It's absolutely critical. There's nothing wrong with a sequential strategy or a sequential concept of victory. But if you, and that's an element of control, right? You have to have control to achieve that. But you also have to have the cumulative control. The cumulative control is the stuff that you can't see. The way that it's often described is sequential effects. There's an arrow that's drawn from point A to point B to point C, right? And usually it's described as a paint splatter. I couldn't find a paint splatter in Microsoft Word or Microsoft PowerPoint, so we did a kind of a splash right here. But the cumulative effects are more of a splatter, more of a splash. They're a lot less focused. They're disparate. They're discrete. They can be all over the place. And how do you gauge that? How do you judge that? Wrong way. Because that's ultimately what he is writing about and what he's wrestling with and that I want to wrestle with today is when you look at the Pacific Theater, and we'll talk about the sequential a little bit, but when you look at the Pacific Theater and you try to judge how much impact these cumulative effects have, how are you supposed to do that? You don't know at the moment that you are having a cumulative impact on your adversary. You hope you are, but as a professional strategist, hope is not a strategy, right? It is not a good strategy to hope that you're having a good effect. You need some way to assess that you're actually having an impact. And with cumulative effects, they are absolutely vital, as I'll showcase today, but they are incredibly, incredibly difficult to assess. And this is, I'll be honest, I don't think Wiley actually resolves this. He doesn't say necessarily, here's how we can assess cumulative effects. What he says is never stop trying. If you stop trying to do cumulative effects, and if you stop trying to assess cumulative effects, you will lose. And the case study here is Japan. Japan loses, in his estimation, in no small part because of this failure right here. They get this. The Japanese get this quite well. They do not understand this, and that is why they lost the war. That is their theory of defeat, if you will. The theory of victory is because we did do a good job at this, but we didn't even know that we were doing a good job at the time. It was only after the fact that we realized how important it was. That's an uncomfortable reality. It's an uncomfortable reality for a strategist, is that you're not always going to have a good glimpse of how good you're doing, how effective you are. But if you stop trying to do it, you are very much at risk of just losing, right? And then what Wiley is really upset about is that you then ask the question, why did we lose? And you don't know. You don't have a good answer for why you won. You don't have a good answer for why you lost. So how are you supposed to grow as a military institution? And I didn't actually put it down. That's why he writes this book. He writes the book to answer that question in the 50s and the 60s. He's writing, reflecting on the Pacific War, but don't decontextualize it out of what's happening in the 50s, the Korean War, and he publishes it in 1967. Where are we? There we go, right? And he is actually writing, and I'll talk about this at the end, he's actually writing in no small part to talk about insurgency. He's trying to say it's so hard to understand why insurgents work or don't work, and we are not well equipped to do it. So let's reframe the way we think. So, again, lots of theory, lots of eyes, head in the cloud here, but now let's get into some specifics. When we look, I cannot go the right way, there we go. When we look at sequential strategies, I'll frame this as the map war, right? And we can see, I'm going to flip through a bunch of maps. You don't really need to pay that close of attention to them, but my point with these is that there's a lot of different ways to understand sequential strategies. There's a lot of different things that we can point to and say, yeah, look, here's Pearl Harbor, then we go to Midway, and then obviously MacArthur is wanting to come down here, Nimitz is going through the Central Pacific, right? There's a lot of different arrows that we can put on the map. Now, ultimately, and we can call this any different number of things, we can say this is cause and effect, right? We see what happens here, and we see that that leads to this. It's comfortable, right? I'm a historian, I love cause and effect, right? This is my bread and butter. It's step by step, links in a chain. This links in a chain idea is actually a pretty important one because one of the things that a good sequential strategist is going to identify is that there's vulnerabilities that come with this as well. One of the reasons why Guadalcanal gets to be so important is because the link that got us to here becomes threatened, right? The Japanese are trying to threaten one of the links in the chain, and so we need to protect it so that our chain remains strong, because if you cut out one of those links, everything's going to fall. Sequential is important. Operation by operation. That's how we plan. That's how we teach people to think, is go operation by operation. Think about what's going to happen next, and think about the operation that comes next. Future ops, right, is what it's called, right? There's a whole planning branch about future operations based on sequential strategies. Very important. Another way to frame it would be, one battle after another. We're also in Oscar season, and this one was nominated quite a bit. I found it a little bit slow, but that's neither here nor there. But it is, right? It is like sequential strategies it's just one battle after another. That's what it is. Some of the key elements when we think about sequential strategies and when we think about strategy in general and theories here, it's thinking about concentration. How do you win the next battle? Almost always, it's by concentrating your forces. Now, the Pacific Theater is one of the fun little examples of that not technically being true, because if you'll note, after Pearl Harbor, when we actually start going into the Japanese, we do split. We split our forces. We have MacArthur and Nimitz going two separate ways. Now, there's good reasons why that was a sound strategy, and it has to do with the extent of the Japanese interior lines and their difficulty of managing those interior lines. But these are the types of questions that a sequential strategist needs to look at. Should we concentrate? How much should we concentrate? How do we win the next battle? That's what I need to know. How do I win the next battle? The way that we did this in the Pacific Theater, again, was through cartwheeling, through island hopping, right? Cartwheel down here, do, island hopping here, do. These very effective. Also incredibly costly, because I worry that as I approach this that I'm saying, I'm just hand-waving sequential, that this is stuff that just kind of, it's boring stuff. No, this is vitally important moments of the war. And I'll make this point at the end, you can't win without this, right? We talk about theories of victory, we talk about how to win the war. You're not winning without Iwo Jima, right? You're not winning without Guadalcanal. These are absolutely necessary to achieving victory. But they're not the only part of it, right? And one of the dangers that you have, because let's flip it for a second, one of the dangers that you have is that you start looking for the decisive point. That's a good thing to do, right? We can defend this idea that how do you win? You search for the decisive point, concentrate your forces at the decisive point, and strike hard and strike fast. No problems there. The problem emerges when you only look for the decisive point. And the case in point here, again, is not necessarily the United States, though we have fell guilty of that a few times, but it's actually Japan. The Japanese strategy is a very, very sequential strategy. They know what the next rung in the ladder is going to be. They start here, they're going to keep on hitting, they're going to hit at Midway. They know what the next step is going to be. And what they focus on almost entirely is the decisive battle. There is, in the Russo-Japanese War, is one of the few cases in, I would say, almost naval history in general, in which you actually can say there is a decisive battle. There's a moment at which one side lost and the other side won. And that's the Battle of Tsushima. And again, this is Russo-Japanese, 1905. The Russians are attacking the Japanese are attacking the Russians. Great little limited war. I won't go into it. But the Japanese win this Battle of Tsushima, and they are chasing that high for the next 40 years, right? They want the decisive battle, and they dedicate nearly their entire national effort to that goal. One decisive knockout blow. It's not the worst idea, right? The problem, of course, as hopefully we know, is that their knockout blow here didn't work, right? This was the knockout blow that just didn't work. They miscalculated for a wide variety of reasons that I won't go into, but they thought that the Pearl Harbor would lead to a negotiated settlement. It didn't. It led to a demand for unconditional surrender that we never let go of. Similar with Midway. They said, well, we're going to throw all our eggs in one basket. Yes, we are going to gamble. There's going to be a little bit of risk here. Any good commander is going to accept risk at various points. We know what we're doing. We're going in eyes open. Not technically true. They went in with quite blind, and the United States went in with more eyes open. But that risk was not out of line with their overall strategic conception. They were trying to hit the knockout punch. But what they didn't realize, and what I want to spend most of the time on here, is that in their search for decisiveness, their search for a decision, what did they miss? They missed the fact that they were being poisoned. The entire time they were being poisoned over and over and over again by this slow, cumulative, to use more metaphor, strangulation, right? This is what's going on the entire time for Japan while they're searching for decisiveness. I'm not saying they could have won, but I am saying that one of their great strategic failures is their lack of adaptation. The fact that they did not identify how they were losing the war. They thought they were losing the war because they lost battles, and in reality they were losing those battles and they lost the war in no small part because of the cumulative effects that they failed to identify. So that's sequential. Like I said, lots of different maps. Here's another way we can look at them, simpler maps. We can look at more complex maps where we can, and you can see here, these are the different battles that are very, very important. There's nothing wrong with maps. I love maps. Here's another one. We got the Allied offensive. This is a little bit what I was talking about, a little bit of the two-pronged approach. We have too big of a exterior line. The Japanese couldn't defend in two places at once. They struggled to, and eventually their inability to do so cost them dearly. This one is a good map that shows, as I'll talk about in a second, the combination between cumulative and I went too far, too fast. The combination between cumulative and sequential. This is a map of how close you needed to be to have a safe air raid on Japan. That is a core element of combination where we can see we have some cumulative elements that we can see in this map, but still arrows and graphs. And this one, I like this sequence of maps. This is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? The story of the war. Right? What else do we need to know? We know how the war was won in these 3 maps, and with these circles, and with these dates, with these guys right here. That's all we need to know about the war, right? Wrong, right? Because what we see with cumulative strategy is not a bunch of maps. Now, I put this map up here to show that I'm lying, because in fact, you can look at cumulative strategy through maps as well. But for the most part, when we look at cumulative strategy, we're looking at graphs, we're looking at numbers, we're down in that dusty room trying to look at those less flashy important things, but still ultimately vital. So what I want to do here is now talk a little bit about what, and we'll look more at those graphs in a second. What is a cumulative strategy? What kind of are the hallmarks of this? Any good strategy is going to look at capacity and will. This is a Clausewitzian framework. How do you win a war? You reduce your enemy's capacity and their will. You can go to, if either of those equals 0, the enemy will cease to fight. What we can say, though, is that both are nearly impossible to reduce to 0. The will to fight, as long as there is someone that will stand up with a spear and attack, right? That will to fight can still be there, right? As long as someone can take down a bamboo shoot or a bamboo stick and sharpen it into a spear, the capacity can still be there, right? So this idea of, oh yeah, that's how you win a war, by reducing capacity and will to 0, that's somewhat mythical. But the idea that these are the factors that you need to attack, that is incredibly useful. What cumulative strategy does is it can attack both of them simultaneously. Sequential also can do that, but cumulative really shines at reducing the capacity to fight, and we'll talk more about that in a second, and reducing the will to fight. So one of the ways in which this comes to, that I think we can really see this is, as I mentioned earlier, Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is a battle, right? It's a sequential battle. It makes sense in this island hopping, cartwheeling type of approach that MacArthur and Nimitz are, and King overall, the CNO back in Washington, are promoting. But what happens in Guadalcanal is not just that Henderson Field is protected and that we maintain our sea lines of communication and our air lines of communication between the disparate Allied theaters. What happens in Guadalcanal is also this. And don't worry about that graph, it's way too small to actually look at anything. But that's another way to view Guadalcanal. And specifically, let's look at two different things that are attrited in Guadalcanal. The first are the pilots, both land and carrier-based pilots, and this is overall in the Solomon Island campaign, but in the Solomon Island campaign, and with Guadalcanal being the key element of that, 87% casualty rate for the Japanese land-based pilots, 98% casualty rate for the carrier-based pilots in this theater. Does this have is this kind of a product of a sequential thing? Yeah, it is. Does it have a cumulative effect that is felt almost imperceptibly throughout the rest of the war? Absolutely, right? They have planes that they can't fly because no one knows how to fly them. And even if you know how to fly them, the amount of expertise and skill that is lost in this campaign, again, it's borderline incalculable. Right? It is incredibly difficult to actually put a finger on it and say, that is why we won the rest of those battles. That's why we had such an easy time in the Marianas Turkey shoot later on. That's why we were able to fly all of those bombing sorties over Japan later on. It's incredibly difficult to put a finger and say, well, yeah, it's because we won right there. We accumulated victory right there. But that's the reality, right? When you're assessing how you won a war, you have to look back to these elements. The other is the fact, and this will be a recurring theme, is we call it the Tokyo Express, right? Is this idea that they are trying so hard to resupply their troops in this theater, in the Solomons and Guadalcanal, that what they're doing is tying supplies to the back of destroyers and just sending those destroyers through the gap, right, through the chute, because they can go fast and they're relatively protected. What is a destroyer good for? Is it good as a cargo ship? Not really, no. And when you are reduced to using one of your highly specialized, critically important naval vessels to ferry supplies in a high-risk situation, something has gone horribly wrong. And this is what we see in Guadalcanal, is not just the story of the Marines and the story of Henderson Field and the incredibly attritional battle that takes place on the ground and at sea. What we see is that this is a moment in which victory was accumulated slowly, but almost inevitably. Now, it doesn't have to be inevitable, because the Japanese can choose to adapt. Guadalcanal is relatively early in the war as far as we're conceiving here, and the Japanese refuse to do so. Let me make sure I know what I'm going to next. Yeah, sure. The Japanese also refuse to adapt when we look at the tonnage war. And here's some of these graphs again. So what we have over here, this is the amount of tons that is produced, naval tonnage that's produced between 1942 and 1945. The little number that you can see over here, don't worry about it, but it's just in case you're wondering, those are the ships that are produced. So battleships, 8 battleships, 320,000 tons, 1 battleship, 64,000 tons, right? So that's one way in which we can view this war, right? Is this a sequential map? No, this isn't sequential at all. This is a way in which we can see the overmatch that the United States brought to bear in terms of their capacity to wage war. We just had more. We could replenish more. We could replenish quicker. That is one of the key ways. It's a logistical element of how we won the war, but it is a vitally important way in which we won the war. The other is not just what was produced here, but it's also what was sunk. So I'm going to round these numbers up. Let's say that at the beginning of the war, the Japanese have about 6 million tons of merchant shipping capacity. Over the course of the war, they get around 4 million more. Some of that is built, some of that is that they acquire from their possessions. By the end of the war, the United States has sunk 9 million tons of merchant shipping. So they started with 6, they ended up at 10, 90% of their capacity was sunk. And that's not even, what we see in this last bit right here is some of what was left couldn't even be used, right? They had ships that didn't have fuel. Right? They had factories that weren't producing anything because they didn't have the raw materials. When you look at this, if I was to show a map of this, and I actually tried to find a good one, and I didn't find one that really made this explicit, what you would see is almost like a Jackson Pollock painting, right? You're going to see splatters all over the map and moments in which submarines in particular are attacking merchant shipping vessels. And just because one merchant ship was sunk off the coast of the Philippines in December of 1943 doesn't mean that the next battle gets won, right? There is no line, there is no arrow connecting what happened to the next victory. But as you accumulate these losses and as you fail to replenish them, ultimately what you're doing is putting your enemy in a choice in which they do not have control of the situation. To Wiley's point, right? They have lost control. Now, they didn't adapt either. One of the great sins of the Japanese here is that they failed to adapt. The Japanese had more submarines than the United States at the start of the war. Right? What were they doing with those submarines? Those submarines were close in with their main battle fleet looking for decisive battle. How do we win the war? We sink their carriers. What do we use to sink their carriers? Maybe submarines. Let's put them in a position to win the war through sinking carriers and having a decisive battle. But what if we attacked the US supply? No. The way we win the war is by decisive battle. What about convoys, right? This is one of the lessons that the United States and Britain learned painfully in the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942 and 1943 is the importance of a convoy system. And there was resistance to it on both sides of the Atlantic. There was resistance to a convoy system, but the strength of the United States was in interacting with an enemy and adapting to the risk that they were showing. So convoys. The Japanese instituted convoys in late 1944. Right? They barely had anything to convoy at that point, right? And even those convoys, it takes practice to run an effective convoy, they were not effective. Right? So the failure to adapt when your enemy poses a problem, poses a question to you, and you fail to adapt to that, that is a true strategic sin. So I make this point, I've made this point a few times now because I don't want to make this seem inevitable. I don't want to make this seem that, only the United States was smart enough to have this. War is interaction. War is absolutely an interaction. It's a choice that you make. And the Japanese chose to ignore cumulative strategy, and the United States invested heavily into it. Did they know that it was going to work? No. They had no idea. These charts do not exist during the war. We do not know. We know that stuff is being sunk. It's not until the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey comes in after the war and actually looks at the books, that's when they see, they had no hope, right? By mid-1944, there was no way for Japan to win the war. But we did not know that. And the last thing, I alluded to it, the last kind of cumulative, we want to look at what is cumulative strategy. Strategic bombing is a hallmark of cumulative strategy that is very difficult to actually say that's the effect that it had. Now, Giulio Douhet was an Italian theorist in the 1920s that argued that it could be decisive, that strategic bombing could lead to a decisive victory, right? That it could have a sequentially decisive effect. He also was essentially advocating for, we'll call it terrorism, right? He was saying that the reason why it'll be decisive is that the people will rise up and overthrow the government because they're so mad at the government for failing to protect them. It's a great idea, and we have never seen it occur in air power history, right? People keep trying it, but we don't see it actually happen. What does happen, and what you see with the way in which the United States employed strategic bombing, at first you see strategic bombing for sequential effects. And this is the bombing raids. You'd have about one a month that comes in 1942-43 coming out of Chengdu in China. Right? Very difficult base to actually protect, very difficult base to supply. It was not very reliable in terms of its impact. And so given they had limited ability to use it, they were trying to use it in a very targeted way, and there was not a great deal of effect that occurred. Once those sequential battles took place, and once you actually start to have Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and then once you have Iwo Jima as a base to have the fighter escorts, now all of a sudden, instead of one sortie a month with 40 or 50 bombers, now you're having 4 to 5, and by 1945, you're having one sortie a day with over 100 bombers, right? And this is absolutely devastating. We don't know how devastating. We don't know exactly what the impact is, but we trust that this will accumulate into a decisive but incredibly difficult to assess victory condition. And this is the firebombing of Tokyo. This is, there are a lot of bombing raids that go on. And I'll just do a brief aside here that there are some lessons learned from the European theater that I can talk about later if you want, but one of the lessons that's learned is that it's actually really difficult to target factories. It's not impossible at this time with the technology, but it is difficult. And one of the metrics for success that they used in Europe during the combined bomber offensive was they considered it a hit if they got within 5 miles of the target. Right? And the ratio of success, of hitting, was below 50%. And that was with daytime bombing. So they reassessed, they adapted, and they said, you know what? Let's just start bombing things where every miss can still be a hit. And this is where you start bombing civilian population centers. You can say that that is a war crime, and in fact, it probably is in some cases. In fact, the US actually said, like, hey, yeah, no, we did do that, right? Don't blame the Germans too much for the Blitz, because we did the exact same thing. It's a viable military strategy. The British called it the dehousing campaign, where it's like, we can't hit the factories, but we can hit the houses of the workers. And so when the workers don't have anywhere to live, they won't be able to go to work in the factories, and the factories will slow down. Pretty brutal, right? And this is kind of Duhay in practice. I have many thoughts on this, I'm not going to go on a rant here, but this is a moment in which in Japan, they don't try to do a lot of targeted bombing, they carpet bomb, right? They just say, we are going to just try to reduce your capacity and will simultaneously with very, very little discretion. This is, again, this is kind of an eye chart. I won't go into it too much, but I'll see if I can send these out or something. But this is a really fun map to look at, and by fun, I mean devastating, but this is the Japanese cities that were bombed with their American equivalents and the percentage that they were destroyed. So Osaka, roughly Chicago, 35% of Osaka or Chicago destroyed. Okayama, about the population density and size of Long Beach, about 70% destroyed. Nagoya, 40%. Again, the utility here is imagine that 40% of LA is destroyed, 75% of Tucson, 37% of San Diego, 50% of New York, 35% of Chicago, right? Imagine that that's happening.
No Boston.
No, I don't think Boston is on there. They was just Boston was just too essential. They couldn't theorize there. But this is like, how does this accumulate, right? This is not just one moment in which these were destroyed. This is a long-standing, very, very brutal, cumulative campaign that wears on both the capacity and the will of the Japanese to make war. What does it do? I'm not actually going to talk too much about this because I think I've made these points more or less, but just to give you some words that I think are pretty important to think of. What is the effect of a cumulative campaign? Suppression, coercion, and perception. And I don't want to diminish that. There is a psychological element to this strategy. You are targeting the will to fight of people and of the state, right? The will of the state to continue fighting. This is, if there's one moment in which you can say that the Japanese are attempting to do this, Pearl Harbor, they're trying to attack the psychological, the psychology of America, and it backfires horribly, but they think that Americans are just going to be, they're bankers, and they're just going to look at the pocketbooks and say it's not worth the investment to actually wage this war. We can give Japan that side of the East Asian Coast Prosperity Sphere, make money off of it, easy peasy. They miscalculated horribly in that, right? Which is one of the reasons why this is again, to that problem of assessment, you can think that you're attacking perception, you can think you're attacking will, when in fact what you're doing is emboldening it. The same thing happens to the United States in Vietnam, where many of the bombs that we dropped did not have the effect that we intended, and in fact created far more insurgents than we actually managed to kill. So though this is part of what it's trying to do, it is also one of the most difficult things to actually achieve. But what is a goal here, again, going back to Wiley, It is paralysis and erosion of choice. It is saying that I control the choices that you have to make. I'm making it so that you cannot make a good choice. The best example of this is in terms of how the Japanese use their steel. What do you do when you have to make a choice? Do you build a new naval vessel or do you build a new merchant vessel? You cannot do both. The United States never had that problem, right? We never had to make that choice. Japan constantly had to make that choice in 1943 and especially 44 and 45. They could not do both. What is the right choice? Spoilers, there isn't one, right? Because by doing one, you are giving up an essential quality that is going to make your path to victory. It is necessary for your path to victory. You are giving your enemy an impossible choice to make, and yet they have to make it. Japan they usually chose merchant vessels, by the way. And then they found they didn't have the oil necessary to actually use those vessels, and they left them sitting in port. Or they found that they didn't have anything to put in the vessels. By 1945, the import capacity of Japan, or the import rate for Japan, was effectively zero. They could not bring anything into their ports. They did try, for the record, they did try to have, I believe it's Ichigo, they tried to have an overland route because these routes were between China and Japan were still relatively difficult for the submarines to go into. It just was not nearly enough. It's also worth noting the Japanese did virtually no ASW, anti-submarine warfare. They just did not have the training doctrine to do it. They thought this was not a good use of resources. And ultimately, though, what does it do? What does it rely on? This is a question of coordination, but it is also, or a question of control. It is vitally necessary that cumulative and sequential work together. And that's what we see the United States truly excel on. If you want the story of why we won the Pacific Theater, it's not just because we had these sequential victories. Absolutely necessary. It's also because we had the hidden victories. But what truly is the answer is we combined those together in a way that made, I mean, really, it's mind-bogglingly effective. And if you can do that, you've got a good chance of winning. As Clausewitz says, the simplest thing is very, very difficult. But this is to note here. What does it not do? What does cumulative strategy not do? It does not win by itself. The good example of this, Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans execute a incredibly powerful cumulative strategy in the Battle of the Atlantic, and they have the happy times and then the second happy times, and we can go into all that, but it is devastating. And Churchill says, like, I can look at maps all day long, but what really makes me not able to sleep at night is these terrible graphs and charts, right? And if you go into the Imperial War bunker, right, he has these graphs about Atlantic shipping. Those are the true terror that's hitting him hard. But what does Germany fail to do? Combine it with any meaningful sequential attack or victory on the British soil, right? They can't do it. Sea lion never happens. So a cumulative strategy doesn't work on its own, but neither does a sequential. This is what Wiley goes on to say. When these cumulative strategies have been used in conjunction with a sequential strategy, directed at a critical point within the enemy structure, this is that center of gravity, right? There are many instances in which the strength of the cumulative has meant the difference between success or failure of the sequential, right? How do you win? You don't just win by having battles. You win by having that undersurface, that connective tissue that makes your victory mean something. When I used to teach undergraduates, I would tell them, when I talk about history, I would say, history is a lot of stuff that doesn't mean anything, right? History is what I had for breakfast. I had something for breakfast. No one cares what I had for breakfast. It was Cheerios, by the way, not Honey Nut, just regular Cheerios. But why do some things matter and some things not? Why do some battles have a decisive impact and some battles seemingly go nowhere? Why does sometimes you put a guy on the ground with a gun and that leads to victory, and sometimes you put a guy on the ground with a gun and it doesn't lead to victory? The answer there is not necessarily about the guy on the ground with the gun. The answer is not necessarily about what you had for breakfast. It's all of that theoretical constructs that make it mean something, that make it matter. And this is not just something that exists in the idea world. This is something that exists and matters in the real world, that it matters how you support those sequential things. So why does it matter? I'm more or less done with my time here. Temptation of maps. This is tempting, right? It's tempting to look at this and know who wins the war, right? We know who wins this war, right? It's not the guys in gray, right? That's not who wins that. There's a temptation in being able to think that you can explain a war through maps. But there's also a temptation of graphs, right? If we stop the graph right here, right? If we stop the graph and start looking at and look at some of these, or even right here, right? We're going to take a look and we're going to say the Germans have an almost insurmountable advantage in the Atlantic. But that doesn't tell the whole story. One of the things that's missing in this case as well that I haven't mentioned is intelligence, right? The ability for the Allies to start to predict where the Germans are going to strike makes it incredibly important. But really what I would argue this all comes down to is how do you know what to look at? How do you know what to look at and when to look at? How do you know when it matters? This is what makes or breaks not just winning a war in the moment, but learning from the wars that you've won, preparing for the next, right? That is where this exercise really matters, is using history, but using history to understand better what's going to happen in the future and to better prepare for what's going to happen in the future. And that means thinking flexible. That means seeing cumulatively and not just hoping, but planning for cumulative success and being able to integrate your sequential effects with your cumulative effects. And hopefully, it'll end up with victory, right? But if you don't know why you got here, if you don't know why the Japanese are surrendering, if you don't know why the atomic bomb was so successful, right? You think, oh, it was so successful because it was a super weapon. That's fair, it was. But this was a super weapon that attacked a hollow core, right? Japan was already effectively defeated. The atomic bomb saved millions, or arguably, saved hundreds of thousands of lives from an invasion, not diminishing the effectiveness or importance of the atomic bomb. But what did it do and why was it successful? Don't just say, yeah, we won because of the bomb. No, we won because of a lot of reasons. Okay, that is, I'll mention this very briefly. As a historian, always important to contextualize, again, Wiley is writing in the 60s. Not only is he writing while thinking about new types of war, looking at Vietnam, he is also writing while thinking, you know who does the best at cumulative effects? It's the Navy, right? So he is writing in defense of the Navy, right? He is saying that the Navy deserves to be invested in heavily. Not to say that it should be that to the exclusion of anything else, but there was talk in the 60s and 70s of saying that, you know, if we're going to be fighting the communists, we need to think about air power and we need to think about land. And he's saying, nope, the Navy matters because we do cumulative better than anybody. Okay, there we go. Questions? A little bit longer than I wanted, but again, I like talking about big ideas, and hopefully I didn't hand wave too many of the interesting things. But happy to answer questions on anything and everything if I can, which is no promises.